All right, Shane.
Yes.
Few people know that how important it is to get a mold right the first time, especially in a project as huge and ambitious as Castle Grayskull.
Absolutely.
Tell me how. What's nerve-wracking about it, as I understand, is if you get the sculpt ready, it's perfect, and you're gonna try to make the mold, and if you don't get the mold, as part of the molding process, it sort of destroys the original sculpt.
It will,
right?
yeah, because it's not solid clay. The clay was applied to hard plastic, so the
you get one chance to get it right.
One chance. If you don't get it right the first time, then you're talking about large sections of the castle being removed. The interior shell can break. If the rubber isn't applied properly, you risk giant air bubbles, which would be devastating to clean.
Right.
You have to make sure the materials that you're using in a way where you have to figure out what the temperature is going to be as that material is setting up, and the percentages of the activators to use to allow for the least amount of shrink possible.
So for lay people like myself, okay, this is the biggest project you guys have ever done. A lot's riding on it, and describe how you feel as you're trying to make that mold the first time, and knowing you've got zero margin for error.
It was extremely stressful in the amount of man hours that went into were put into creating the original sculpt, the castle. Hundreds and hundreds of hours. A lot of different people, a lot of time spent preparing, planning this out, and we get it, and at first thought we see that we don't think it's moldable in the condition that it's in. We think we're going to have to go in and cut the castle apart to make it a little more manageable for us, but we didn't want any error in production or how we were going to cast it. We didn't want any error that the pieces wouldn't fit together, so we wanted to keep that original vacuum formed feel to it, like the original. So we had to really take a lot of time looking over, planning how to set it up, how we were going to ensure that it was going to be a successful pour, because you can get the rubber on it and the mother mold, which is the hard shell, over the rubber, and that's only half of it. The other half is getting a clean casting, making sure there's no giant air bubbles, fixing any undercuts, proper ventilation, so when you pour the material, the urethane, that it's going to flow throughout the entire mold and not trap air, and it'll come out in one piece.
That's the casting part.
That is the casting.
But making the mold, that process destroys the original sculpt.
Sure.
Okay.
Yep.
So how long does it take? Are you on pins and needles, sweating bullets for how long? Until you know where it's going to go. Wow.
The first side of the mold, the front, we did first. We had to clay that up, and just claying the mold up to prepare it for a 2-part mold took about 6 hours. And backfilling everything, making the keys, and we had to build a wooden box around it, so when we poured the rubber, it would allow us the strength. Usually we use hot glue and styrene to make our molds. You can see we're talking about little tiny molds for little tiny parts.
Right.
This came out of this, which is no big deal. But now we're talking about we're gonna use 300 to 400 pounds of silicone on one half of the castle. So the nervousness just gets amplified because you got to get it right the first time. But after we get it clayed up and the walls built around it, we start applying the silicone over the course of a few days. It's too big to pressurize, which we usually pressurize rubber. But we vacuumed the rubber to degas it to make sure there's no bubbles, and we just slowly built up layers and layers of rubber over the course of a few days until we had about an inch thick, and then we put what's called a mother mold over top of that. It's like a fiberglass shell. And once that's done, you got to take the whole thing, flip it over, and do the same process on the inside. You have to apply mold release and make sure everything looks good, it's lined up in the same procedure. So the molding itself takes, to the front took about a week to do. And
so when you knew everything went fine and you had a good mold, what did that feel like?
well, the mold, when we knew we had a good mold, but we didn't know how the casting was going to go.
Oh, so it's the nerves aren't over yet.
The nerves aren't over yet. So when we did our first test, we did about 3 test pours with a quick setting material. The first test, we blew the bottom of the mold out. So it took almost a full gallon of material to fill the front of the castle, and next thing you know, we've got a gallon of resin that's curing just coming out of the bottom all over the floor, and we were a little panicked. Well, we recalibrated, we built a frame for that mold, and we just bolted it together. Rather than having straps, we got 2x4s. We drove 8-inch bolts through the whole thing with cranked that tight. We got a second casting. We felt confident enough that we could do our slow setting material, and we poured that slow setting material. It took about 8 hours to cure, and that will allow us the least amount of shrink possible. And came in the next day, and it was perfect. And that was like the weight of actual Castle Grayskull lifting off our shoulders.
Hallelujah, huh?
Yeah.
So the steel mold for that is going to be massive and
it really
expensive.
is. I don't know if they're going to be able to do it in one piece. They might have to cut it up and assemble it in production. But yeah, I would love to see how they do that in production.
Cool. All right, thanks.